Hello, everyone. How are you doing? We have the true honor and privilege of having Dr. Orlando Pérez here. He's going to talk to us about the armed forces, security, and current affairs in Latin America. Dr. Pérez is a distinguished, world-renowned expert on Latin America. He served as the dean of the School of Liberal Arts and Sciences at the University of North Texas from 2019 to 2023. Previously, he was also an associate dean at Millersville University in Pennsylvania. Also spent many years as a professor in Central Michigan University. Has written extensively on Central America, the armed forces, places like Panama and Honduras. Has published a terrific book with his colleagues Lucia Dammert and Mary Malone just recently on policing in Latin America. Has looked at a lot of issues in terms of trust and working extensively with survey data. So thank you so much, Dr. Perez, for joining us today.
Well, thank you for that nice introduction, and great to be with you, Jonathan, and to speak to your students.
Thank you so much. So out of all things, how did you become interested in these topics?
Well, that's a great question, and it's a long story. I'm going to try to make it as brief as possible, but there are lessons in my story which I think your students might take and might enjoy and maybe take to heart. Um, so I was so I'm a first generation immigrant to the United States. I was born in Cuba, so I'm a Cuban American raised in the United States. My family left Cuba when I was 2 years old, and I was raised in Puerto Rico first, and then South Florida. And that's an interesting context for what comes next. So I initially, when I went to school, thought that I wanted to be a physician, a doctor. And I started my academic career at Miami-Dade Community College and then the University of Miami as a pre-med student and a biochem major. And that, towards the end of the 4 years, wasn't working out. And so I took some time off, and I had always, because of my family background, I think I had always been interested in politics. And so I took a year to sort of reflect on where I wanted to go, and ended up returning to school and getting a degree in political science, a bachelor's in political science at Florida International University, an institution that you know very well. And there I met, and he was my first sort of major mentor, Eduardo Gamarra, who you know as well, and Darío Moreno, who you know as well from FIU. So both of them encouraged me to get a PhD. I didn't know what I would do with a PhD, but they encouraged me. They said, you're good at writing, you're good at doing research. And so through their help, and particularly Eduardo's help, I ended up at the University of Pittsburgh doing a PhD in political science. I started out wanting to work with Jim Malloy, who was an institutionalist and a Weberian at that, and had been Gamarra's mentor. That didn't work out for a number of reasons, and I shifted to working with Mitch Selick, who is, as you know, rest in peace. He died a year ago, and but he is the founder of the Latin American Public Opinion Project. And then through him, I got involved in that project when it wasn't even LAPO yet. It was a Mellon Foundation funded grant program that brought together a cohort of graduate students to do the first really scientific, academic survey research in Central America. And I ended up doing Panama. And so I traveled to Panama, and in my first trip there to run a survey, the first survey that had been done in Panama from an academic perspective post-invasion. This was in 1991, I think, a year or so after the invasion. I obviously made a lot of contacts, and one of the key contacts that I made was with the person that would, in the end, become my wife. She was one of the university students who we hired to conduct this survey. So coming back to Pittsburgh, I had made all of the contacts in Panama. I had worked on the survey research. And so I decided that I would do a dissertation looking at post-invasion Panama and elite political culture, right? So the transformation of elite political culture in post-invasion Panama using those initial surveys plus additional elite interviews and surveys and a number of other data, historical documents, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what I did. That's how I got involved in, that's how I got the dissertation done, which became my first book. Through that process, I met another great mentor, Richard Millett. Through Richard Millett, who you probably know, he's deceased now, but he introduced me really to the civil-military relations field. He was great at introducing students to other contacts and connecting people to other people. And through those two contacts, through Mitch and through Richard, I generated a Rolodex, if you will, of contacts, not just in Panama, but in Central America, because Richard and Mitch had extensive contacts throughout Central America. And so that's how I got involved in these topics. The issue of civil-military relations and the military, I went at it from the perspective of the LAPOP survey data, which showed, as I think you know, that the military is among the most trusted institution. And so starting with that question and then looking at how the military was transformed post-conflict in the rest of Central America beyond Panama, right? So Guatemala, Salvador, Nicaragua, and Honduras have, in the 1980s, had transitions to democracy. In some cases, post-civil wars and post-peace processes. And those peace processes generated significant changes, doctrinal changes, personnel changes, changes in the status of the education of the military, legal changes, constitutional changes that affected the military. And through those questions, I wrote my second book, my second solo book, which was on civil-military relations in post-conflict Central America, looking at how the military was transformed. So it was through having very good mentors and then having some very good co-authors. You mentioned Lucia Dammert and Mary Fran Malone, who you know. Christine Wade has been a colleague and friend and co-author for many years. Ricardo Córdoba Macías in El Salvador opened doors through Fundaungo. It was through him that I got to know a lot of the military officers and a lot of the politicians in El Salvador. Jose Manuel Ugarte, who's an Argentinian, very much deeply involved in civil-military relations, David Pian Berlin. So I owe a lot to Rafa Martinez, who's a Spaniard who does a lot of work on civil-military relations. So I owe a lot to mentors, and I owe a lot to co-authors, colleagues who have taught me a great deal. You yourself, you invited me to write a chapter for one of your books. I've reviewed some of your books for publishers. So, I mean, those contacts are essential. And they really tell the story of my career.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much. And I encourage for all the students to read Dr. Perez's work, a terrific writer and very, very clear. So what do you see as some of the biggest challenges in Latin America in terms of security, and particularly in your area, focusing kind of the Northern Triangle countries of Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Panama? What are the biggest challenges today that you see?
Yeah. So, and you probably know a lot of these even better than me because of your work. But I think, if you look at the Northern Triangle, you really have to think about issues like transnational organized crime, weak judicial systems, pervasive corruption, deep socioeconomic inequality. I think, you know, throughout the period that we're talking about since the 1990s, the rise of gangs, MS-13, Barrio 18, again, which you've written extensively on, these groups have entrenched themselves in communities where the state is absent or compromised, right? The other concern, I think, is the reaction to those issues of crime, right? So in El Salvador, under Bukele's state of emergency policies, there had been a significant reduction in gang activity, and we can talk about why that is. But part of it is a significant cost in civil liberties, in due process, and an erosion of democratic values. Guatemala under Arevalo is trying a different path, right? That is focused on anti-corruption. But there you have entrenched elites that are blocking reforms at every turn. Honduras adopted a similar approach as El Salvador, even with a leftist-oriented government, but is now to double down. Despite what the security minister said, it's probably going to double down on mano dura, double down on the Bukele model, which I think has been spreading. Costa Rica, with the new president and President Chavez as well, have doubled down on these coercive approaches to dealing with crime, which are very popular with the population, but they do erode democratic principles. Panama, a little bit different. They face somewhat different issues. They don't have an army, as you probably know. The military was abolished after the invasion in 1989, so its security forces are police-based. Panama's challenges, frankly, center on being a major transit corridor. A transit corridor for goods and services, but also a transit corridor for drug trafficking. And also managing the flow of migrants through the Darien Gap. This has been a major issue between the United States and Panama. And of course, the whole relationship between the United States and Panama over the Panama Canal and over competition with China has really framed Panama's foreign policy, Panama's geopolitical framework since Trump returned to the White House in January of 2025. There has been a battle to control, to manage ports and port infrastructure within the country. As you probably have read, there has been a recent Supreme Court ruling that invalidated the concession to C.K. Hutchison, which is a Chinese affiliated conglomerate. And that concession or invalidating that concession has opened an opportunity for Panama to retender the ports and maybe find different investors to manage the ports. BlackRock, which is one of the largest investment firms in the world and is U.S. based, it's global, but it's U.S. based in terms of its leadership, has shown an interest, not just in the ports in Panama, Cristobal and Balboa, but also in ports in the rest of Latin America as part of a deal with Hutchison that involves the transfer of the control of those ports. So we'll see how that moves forward. But I think those things kind of frame the issues that I see in Central America and in Panama.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you so much. So you've written extensively on trust in institutions in Latin America. Why is distrust among so many institutions so high?
Yeah, as you know, the LAPOP America's Barometer data is one of the leading cross-national survey instruments, one of the more serious, one of the most scientific, and I've been involved in that for close to 30 years. And what the data has shown is that consistently declining confidence in the legislature, in courts, and in particular political parties across the region. By 2023, by the 2023 rounds are every 2 years. Trust in elections, for example, had fallen to historic lows in many countries. And I think several factors drive this trust levels. Corruption is pervasive and often goes unpunished, right? Reinforcing the perception that systems protect elite and don't protect the population. Government performance on basic services, security, healthcare, education, also remains relatively poor in many countries. And so democratic institutions who were supposed to deliver not just political freedom, but tangible improvements in people's lives, when they fail to do that, legitimacy erodes, legitimacy goes down. There's also what I have called a performance gap. The distance between what citizens expect from democracy and what they actually experience. I'm working on a paper that looks at Panama, right? That shows that even in a country like Panama, with relatively strong economic growth, with democratic satisfaction, can decline significantly to its lowest levels since the invasion, really, when citizens feel excluded from the benefits of that growth, right? When corruption, for example, undermines faith in the political class. So this gap is dangerous because it opens space for authoritarian populists, as we've seen, right? Who promise to cut through institutional gridlock, like Bukele, and often at the expense of democratic norms.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fascinating. You've written extensively on the armed forces in Latin America. And as you mentioned in the beginning, that the military tends to be one of the most trusted institutions, according to a lot of the survey data. Can you talk about why is it the military is more trusted and then compared to the police, which in some countries is highly distrusted? And as I mentioned, you have a terrific book with your colleagues, Mary Fran Malone and Lucia Dammert that came out, Lynn Reiner, highly recommend on policing. So what are some of the differences in trust between those two institutions?
Yeah, well, I think the reasons are partly institutional and partly symbolic, right? So the militaries are seen as more disciplined, less corrupt, and more organized than civilian institutions. Ironically, the very fact that the militaries, because of the transitions, because of the peace accords, because of the processes of transformation that occurred as a result of those accords and as a result of that transition, led militaries to, in essence, go back to the barracks, right? And depoliticize in some ways, okay, symbolically in many countries. It has given them credibility where politicians do not have or lack, right? So the military carries patriotic symbolism that boosts their standing, right? The police, in comparison, tend to rank much lower, right? You mentioned our book, right? So police forces across Latin America are in direct daily contact with citizens. And that contact frequently is negative. Corruption is pervasive in many police forces. Extortion, bribery, collusion with criminal organizations, all of that is well documented. So citizens who have been victimized by crime, and this is a finding across the literature and in the book that I wrote with Mary and Lucia, citizens who have been victimized by crime and then encounter police interference or complicity understandably lose trust, right? They lose trust on the police, and that reflects maybe in higher trust for the military. The police also carry the burden of enforcement in a highly unequal society. The paradox here is that high military trust can become a problem for democracy. When citizens trust soldiers more than judges or legislators, it creates a permissive environment for expanding military roles into policing, disaster response, infrastructure, and a number of other areas. They become multi-purpose institutions, right? And that's exactly what we are seeing. And ironically, and I'm very anxious to get the latest, the newest version of this data, because what we've seen is the military getting involved in areas which are very politically fraught and which are tied to some very unpopular policies that have not panned out entirely. And so has that politicization, has that linkage with the incumbent presidents, have that eroded the symbolic apolitical nature of the military institution? Findings from places like Venezuela, for example, show that the more the militaries become identified with a particular party or a particular leader, the less legitimacy the institution has among the public.
So you mentioned the military being involved in kind of internal issues and counter-narcotics in terms of going after criminal organizations and these mano dura or iron fist type strategies. Do you see the military being overstretched? And do you see this as one of the big challenges going forward?
Oh, absolutely. I think the results of using the military in internal policing and internal security functions, while understandable from the perspective of a state that is overwhelmed by transnational crime, and a state that is dealing with the clamor of the population to do something, right? And it sees the armed forces as the quickest, surest way of dealing with a problem that is perhaps getting out of hand, and that the civilian police and civilian institutions aren't able to deal with. The results are mixed, right? So in some cases, visible military presence has reduced certain types of violence in the short term. Long-term consequences can be troubling, right? So military forces are trained, as you know, for external defense, for killing the enemy, not for community policing, not for arresting criminals, right? Their deployment often leads to significant human rights violation, right? As documented by Human Rights Watch, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. It also delays the harder work of building professional, accountable police forces and functioning judicial systems. If you can rely on the military, then you don't need to strengthen police institutions. Once the military takes on internal security forces and the budgets and political influence that come with them, it becomes very difficult to course. Presidents become attached to that policy, and since they are the commanders in chief and they can order the militaries to do these things, and the military usually sees them not not necessarily as a welcomed mission, but as a necessary mission to justify their existence and to justify their performance and their budget. And so they become the lifeline for the military to gain access to resources. And so they will do it, but then that process becomes, instead of exceptional, instead of periodic, it becomes permanent. And so you've now transformed militaries who, by law, by constitution, and by training, are focused or should be focused on external defense. You've turned them inward to internal security. Ironically, that's exactly what the militaries were involved in during the dictatorships, right? During the military dictatorships. And so ironically, you've sort of empowered the military back to where they were before they went back to the barracks as part of the process of democratization. And in the Northern Triangle, in the post-conflict, post-peace accords states, Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, all of those missions are Honduras. They're all against the letter of the peace accords.
Yeah, absolutely. No, those are terrific points. Pivoting in our last couple of questions to the case of the current situation in Venezuela, which you've been writing and speaking a great deal about. Can you talk about how you evaluate the current situation? And you've discussed a little bit, you've seen this kind of perhaps faulty comparison between Venezuela and Panama in 1989. You've argued that these are very different contexts. Could you maybe explain some of this and the differences and how you see the current challenges?
Yeah. So it's it's a very interesting question, and it's something that that I was asked repeatedly before the operation. I guess it was called Dissolve, the operation, the grab and go, as I call it, that took Maduro, that arrested Maduro. So first of all, I think it's important for your students to understand that what we've had in Venezuela is not regime change. That we have not changed the regime. We have decapitated a government, and we are now working with the remnants of that regime, more specifically the vice president to Maduro, Delcy Rodriguez, and her brother Jorge Rodriguez, who leads the National Assembly and is an important figure. So it's really a duopoly, and you have to think of them as a duopoly. As Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, and the President, and other administration leaders have described, is a process which is first to stabilize the country, then to rehabilitate the oil industry, and then third, maybe a transition process to some undefined regime status. They talk vaguely about elections, they talk vaguely about openness, they talk vaguely about democracy, but it's really kind of the last adjective, right? They've foregrounded stability, friendliness, and prosperity, right? Which is akin to rehabilitating the oil industry. That is what we seem to be doing post Maduro, right? And it's still open whether or not this is going to succeed. I've been working on this issue, and I'm working with a group of Venezuelan and U.S. scholars who are looking at what might a actual transition to democracy require from many different levels. And I don't think the administration is at this moment working in that direction at all. Right? That's simply not the staging or the sequencing that we're seeing. Now, to the comparison with Panama, I think there's no comparison. The comparison is an illusion. Venezuela is 12 times larger than Panama. Venezuela's military, Venezuela's security architecture, Venezuela's intelligence architecture, all of that is much more elaborate, much more layered, as I've written for War on the Rocks a couple of times. It is a layered security system in which you also have paramilitary forces involved that are key to the regime's repressive and coercive system. And so disentangling all of that was going to be very difficult without a much larger force than was applied in Panama, upwards of maybe 50, 60, 70,000. And then a even larger, perhaps, stabilization force to disarticulate, right, to disband these security elements. And the administration was very clear post the Maduro takedown that they went that route because they didn't want to risk the chaos that could have happened had they done a real invasion, had they actually invaded with ground troops, the so-called boots on the ground. It is interesting as well and important to this scenario what President Trump said after the capture of Maduro about Maria Corina Machado, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, and really the leader of a large sector of the opposition in Venezuela. He said she's a nice lady, but she doesn't have the support internally. And what he meant was, and polls show that she does have the support of the civilian population, but what he meant was she didn't have the support of the security forces. And doing a Panama situation or replicating Panama, where the United States already had troops because it had them stationed in the Canal Zone by treaty, where we had intelligence, where the deployment of the Panamanian Defense Forces was entirely different and concentrated in Panama City rather than Venezuela, which is a much larger country with a much more complicated geography, both urban geography and rural geography as well, and jungle territories which were being used by Colombian guerrilla factions to cross the border almost with impunity and to engage in illicit activities. All of that meant that the United States could not guarantee that without a major effort, costlier effort, and without a longer-term military presence in Venezuela, that installing Maria Corina Machado or installing Edmundo González Urrutia, the winners of the 2024 elections, as we did in Panama with Guillermo Endara, Ricardo Arias Calderón, and Guillermo Billy Ford, immediately the night of the invasion, we swore them in, or they were sworn in at a U.S. base in the Canal Zone and then took over. That scenario was not possible in the context of Venezuela. So the two cases are very different. And I think given all of the problems, I think between a full-blown military incursion with 50, 60, 70,000 troops, what that all entailed, and what we did, I think it was smarter to do what we did. the question, of course, is what comes next. And the problem is that we are now engaged with the same people who sustained and supported a repressive regime for 26 years. And we're trying to move them in the direction of making concessions, but it doesn't seem to be the case that the president, at least the president, Trump, is concerned at all about democracy or democratization, not in Venezuela, not anywhere. And so it's hard to see how policy leads to a democratic Venezuela, at least in the short term, certainly, or certainly not in the short term, but maybe even in the medium term, because elements of the opposition are not involved in any type of negotiation in Venezuela right now. The United States is not pushing a timetable and benchmarks on when elections are going to happen. It's sort of like, yes, we want elections, but we have to stabilize the situation. We have to, rehabilitate the oil industry. We want that control of that oil. And of course, the regime loyalists, the Chavistas who are still in power, are playing for time, right? They're waiting Trump out. That's the fact. They have a window, they're waiting for the midterms to see if the Democrats win control of Congress. And then ultimately they're waiting Trump out and see if they can survive until, January of 2029 and the situation in Washington changes. In any event, I think what they're trying to do is they're trying to set up rules that would either guarantee them a victory in future electoral contests, make it difficult for the opposition to win and govern, or at the very least, if they are to give up power, that they could come back to power in the short term rather than be denied power permanently. I think that's the terrain that Chavistas are working on in Venezuela at this moment.
One final question. So, what is the impact of what's happening in Venezuela on the reputation of the United States in the region, particularly thinking perhaps in terms of alliances and what Joseph Nye, famously coined soft power?
So, that's an interesting question, right? So the Venezuela operation and the broader militarization of U.S. policy under Trump, second term, have significantly, I think, in my view, damaged U.S. soft power in Latin America, right? So even countries that are allied with Washington are, I think, uncomfortable with the president of forcibly removing a head of state, even right. The United States has significant economic and military leverage, right? So, and if you look at the Trump corollary, or also so-called Donroe Doctrine, and the National Security Strategy 2025, they all recover, right? Or vindicate again the whole idea of the Monroe Doctrine, the whole idea of spheres of influence, and that the Western Hemisphere is the U.S.'s sphere of influence, right? And the U.S. approach has shifted from multilateral cooperation to what someone called conditionality diplomacy, right? You cooperate on our terms, or you face. That works in the short term with small dependent states. It does not build the kind of durable partnerships that sustain influence over time, right? And meanwhile, China's economic footprint in the region continues to grow, right? The very aggressiveness of U.S. policy in Panama and over the Panama Canal may push some countries to diversify their relationship precisely to avoid being caught in the crossfire of great power competition, right? The risk for Washington in this whole, environment is that by relying too heavily on coercion, it accelerates the very dynamic it is trying to prevent, right? That Latin American countries hedging their between the U.S. And China. I think also the concerted emphasis on the migration issue, foregrounding migration as the key relational framework by which we see the relationships, particularly with Central American countries, that has the potential of empowering presidents like Nayib Bukele, who are undermining democracy. And we see this, the Trump administration has celebrated its relationship with Bukele, has celebrated the victory of Asfura in Honduras, of Fernandez in Costa Rica, its relationship with Mulino in Panama, its relationship and agreements with a center-left leader like Bernardo Arevalo in Guatemala, its relationship with Sheinbaum in Mexico, right? And the fact that, he keeps saying, I work very well with Sheinbaum. And Sheinbaum has a rhetoric and a narrative that she plays inside, but at the same time, she is cooperating with U.S. policy. And we saw it in the takedown of El Mencho, right? The leader of the Jalisco Nueva Generación, a new generation cartel. That was a mission that happened because of the cooperation between the Mexican military and Mexican police forces and U.S. intelligence, right? And so Trump has celebrated all of these things, but by the same token, a lot of the policies that many of these presidents, particularly in America, are pursuing are eroding democratic norms, are eroding, no one more than Bukele, but nonetheless, they're eroding those norms. And we have now in Argentina, we have now in Chile, we have in Paraguay, we have in Ecuador. We just saw in Ecuador, for example, a military operation, a joint military operation between the U.S. and the Ecuadorians. So these relationships are moving towards empowering policies, which I think in the long term are going to erode democratic norms in the region. So the transition from the U.S. as a promoter of democracy to overtly saying we don't care about democracy, we care about partners that can get results, and democracy be damned. If you have to break some glass to get criminals in mega prisons, then that's fine, because results are more important than the process. Results are more important than human rights. Results are more important than democracy. That is, I think, dangerous for the long-term position of the United States in the region and for our long-term relations in the region. Those are the kinds of policies that I think will generate a reaction, a nationalistic and a citizen reaction, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually that we may come to regret very deeply in terms of the governments that will follow. As you know, Latin America has a history of pendulum swings, of cycles. And the pendulum is now on the right and on these mano dura policies. But I predict that we are going to see a reaction to it, and we are going to see a pendulum swing back. And it may swing back very, very harshly, very much anti US, anti-American, and I don't think we're going to like the results.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time. I highly recommend the work of Dr. Perez, a terrific, terrific scholar and teacher, and just a wonderful colleague. Thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Thank you for having me, Jonathan. This has been fun.
Thank you.